Color correction versus color grading. What's the difference and how can they help you make better videos? I'm Sean Michael Jordan, and today we're gonna go over specifically how I grade my videos and how I color correct my videos based off of questions other people have had about them. And we're gonna talk about the differences between the two because I think it's very important to understand what they are before you actually start using these. Color correction is simply making sure that every shot matches each other. So when you cut from one shot to the next, the audience doesn't go, that one looks a little weird. It's kind of green. Or why is this one so dark? And why does he look like that guy has a sunburn? Color correction is all about consistency. And it's especially important between different cameras. If you're gonna shoot with a Sony camera or a Canon camera and try and put it all together, you wanna make sure that each shot matches. It's typically the first thing you do to your footage. That way, whenever the audience looks at it, even if it's not completely finished, you're not going, oh, this looks kind of really bad. Color grading is the creative side. It is the fun side of color and contrast. It's all about setting a specific tone or mood by either warming up the colors or cooling them down, maybe giving it more of a green look, depending on what you're going for. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I am in no way a professional colorist, and everything in this video is based off of my experiences and what I've learned over time. I also want to let you know that I actually have a color deficiency, so I don't see color the way everyone else does. Red does not show up very well for me at all. So if you're colorblind or have some sort of color deficiency like I do, this video might help you out quite a bit. Because we're gonna be color correcting and color grading not based off of what our eyeballs see, but what the waveform tells us and a combination between the two. So without further ado, let's get into this and let's get started. The way you color correct and color grade is different for every individual. Everybody's got their own style and their own way of doing it, but there's typically a few steps that you will take as far as a baseline, and then you can tweak it from there. So typically you want to do your corrections first, do a base correction. Now, here is the footage here from one of my videos. It's the, it's actually a Slender Man parody. It's episode 4. This is a drone shot. I actually had somebody ask specifically how I got the color grade for these videos. So we're gonna go over how I achieved the look. So what I typically do, I'm gonna turn off all of the color grading and color corrections just so you can see what the footage looks like beforehand. So here is how it's going to look before I've done anything to the footage. This is straight out of the camera, how I record it. I record very flat because I want to both get as much dynamic range as I can, as well as have a lot of flexibility in how I want it to look. If I want it to look like a sunset, very, very warm sunset, I can change that. If I want it to be more of a cool drab look, then I can also change that as well. Bear in mind, there's pros and cons to shooting at extremely flat on a camera that compresses the image file. You're gonna lose detail in the mid-range, but we'll go over that in a completely different video. But what I typically do is I start out and I try to match every single shot. So with that, the color grading and color corrections turned off, here's what it's gonna look like between each shot. Now I wanna make sure that from between each shot is going to look fairly similar as far as the exposure values and the contrast. I'm not worried about the black levels or how bright the whites are as far as if they're true blacks or true whites. I'm simply trying to make sure all the shots match, and I usually find the best shot that I have, which is this entry shot, and I match everything to that best shot. So after I did do that, actually on this specific one, I pulled the exposure down because it was a little bit brighter than the rest of the shots. So specifically because of the downward, the way you're looking down in some of these shots, you're gonna be away from the sun. So I did want to keep them to be darker because they should be, but I didn't want them to be completely different. Like from this shot to this shot, it was much too bright. So I went ahead and darkened the overall exposure on here. And overall, I didn't have to do a lot because when you do shoot, you want to make sure that your white balance is set and locked in. That's why we don't use automatic white balance. It makes it very, very easy to match later on. Once I do that and make sure that they match as far as exposure, I want to look and make sure that the color values are going to be similar. Now, again, I said that I have a hard time seeing red, so if a shot is a bit possibly too far in the magenta range, I can't really see that. So how do you do that? Well, I use Adobe Premiere Pro. If you don't have Adobe Premiere Pro, you can use a free program called DaVinci Resolve. I'll put that in the link below. DaVinci Resolve is a free program that is amazing at color. It actually has more color options and more grading capabilities than Lumetri has in Adobe Premiere Pro, but it is free. Bear in mind that it is very resource intensive. When I open that thing and I have like 20 seconds of video, it immediately eats up 8 gigs of RAM. So you have to have at least 8 gigs of RAM, pretty decent computer to use it, but there is a free version. It is free, and you can do everything that I'm doing here for free. So what you're gonna do here is you're gonna look at what's called a scope. There's a few different scopes here. Over here on the left, you'll see I have 3 different scopes that I use pretty much all the time to grade all of my stuff. Up at the top left here is going to be a waveform, Luma waveform. So this waveform, I'll pull it down here at the bottom. What it does is it shows you where everything lies on the screen. So from left to right is going to be the same as left to right on here. So as you can see right here is going to be a little bit brighter because of the sun. From the bottom to the top is going to be darks and your whites. So blacks lay all the way down at 0, that's going to be completely black, and all the way at 100 is going to be completely white. There's typically going to be no detail here, or all the way at 0 and 100. And everything in between is going to be the shadows, mid-range, and highlights. From about 0 to 20 is your blacks. From 20 to 40 is your shadows. 40 to 60 midtones, 60 to 80 highlights, 80 to 100 is going to be your whites. Pretty much every color program is going to have at least blacks and whites. They might have highlights and shadows. It depends on which editing program you're using. But if you get DaVinci Resolve or Adobe Premiere Pro, you can see these on this waveform. This will tell me if my image is too washed out, how much contrast there is, and everything else. The second thing I look at is called the RGB parade. I'm going to move that over. That's this guy over here. It's got red, green, and blue. This is what I use specifically. Let me just flip these around. This is what I use specifically to tell me whether or not the colors are too red or maybe too green, too magenta, maybe too warm or too cold. This is very, very good for someone like me who can't see the red very well. So for example, if I push this over to magenta, you'll see the red move way up compared to the green. And by changing these values, I can see without even looking at my image how warm or cool the image is going to be. If I slide the temperature slider over to cool, I'll see the blue is way up. I know that this image is going over here is going to be very cool because the blue is way higher in value than the other 2 colors. So it helps me out quite a bit, and even if you can see color just fine, this is something that you're going to want to use all the time. The third thing that I use is the vector scope, specifically the YUV. This is going to show me, let me pull this up by itself so you can see it. So your vector scope is going to have, it's basically a color wheel right here. You can see it's got R for red, magenta's over here, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. And right here in the middle is actually going to be the saturation. So the farther out away from the center, the more saturated the image is going to be. So if I pull the saturation over, you'll see that these get pulled way out here. And if I pull it back in, you'll see it shrink back down. The limits of your saturation is going to be this line that intersects all of these different colors. That's going to be kind of the limit of saturation. If you're going past that, you're going to be oversaturated. It's going to be way too much color. And then there's actually a few lines here that we'll go over here in a second. But this, you can also use this to help with your skin tones. So let me go back. let me pull this back up to the way it was. And I like RGB Parade to be at the bottom because I have the most trouble with this. So what I'll typically do here is I'll pull up these scopes, and once I do my first pass of corrections on each of the different clips, then I will actually pull up an adjustment layer. These right here are adjustment layers, and I've got them turned off right now, but basically an adjustment layer it allows you to make changes to a range of clips without having to copy and paste that change to every single clip. It's something I use it to save time. If your editing program doesn't have it, don't worry, you can just copy and paste your corrections or your color grade to each clip. So most of them will let you just drag over a set of clips and then right click and then paste it. You can do that here. I can copy a grade or a correction and then click on a different clip and then paste attributes, and then I'll be able to actually paste the effect of lumetri color. Whatever corrections I did on one clip, I can paste in another, or I can select a bunch of different clips like this and then apply them to all of them. Most programs will let you do that if you don't have something like Adobe Premiere or you can't run DaVinci Resolve. So back again to the adjustment layers. I usually use 1 or 2 adjustment layers. I always use an adjustment layer for my color grade. This allows me to grade over the top of all the different corrections I already made, and it also lets me do a color grade on everything, saves time. Sometimes I'll do this. This is actually a correction adjustment layer that I use specifically for when I don't quite get the exposure correct for every single shot. In this case, I underexposed it on purpose so that I would be able to get the sun. If I overexposed it, I might blow out this sun here, and I won't be able to get any of the clouds or any of the background, and all the shots would be wasted. So I underexposed it a little bit so I could bring it back up later in post. And that's what this color correction right here is. From the correction, you can see the changes that I've made. And essentially what I do here is once I get all the shots to match, then I apply a base correction. And here on the right, you can see what I've done. I've brought the exposure up in value from what it was previously. So I bring the exposure up to brighten the shots in general. And then another thing I did, a lot of these shots, the shadows were a little bit crushed down. They were losing detail because they were too close to black. So I brought the shadows up just a hair, just to kind of bring up the overall glow and detail in maybe some of the darker areas. And then I brought the black levels down. That gives the overall image a bit more contrast. So this is what I end up with the end correction here. Let me go to a different shot possibly here, just so you can see what it looks like. And here, we'll do this shot right here. So overall, I didn't do too much to this. This is just kind of my base correction. And then here's my end color grade. This is the creative side. And I did this actually a couple ways than I normally do. All right, so on the color grade, you can see right here, it says input LUT. Let me go over what a LUT is very briefly. LUT stands for lookup table. Essentially what that is in a simplified term, it's like an Instagram filter. What a LUT does is it looks up the color information in the frame and then changes those values based off of a preset. So it basically, whatever colors are on the screen, it will take those numbers and then shift them to a different value that's preset based off of the lookup table. So a green, it'll shift, if it sees X amount of green or a type of green, it's going to shift it to a different color. There's 2 different ways to use a LUT. There's an input LUT, which is right here. This is basically what you're going to do on a lot of cameras that shoot in log, or some of your high-end cameras like the Arri Alexa, some of the Red cameras and things like that. They'll have some LUTs, depending on whether you shot in log or Rec 709. Kind of those are some more advanced stuff, but essentially this is your base correction, and it'll get the colors up to about where they would be if you would have shot it in a standard profile instead of a flat image. And you can use input LUT several different ways, but that's essentially what the input LUT is for. The input LUT basically takes precedence over any other corrections that you would make over here in your basic corrections. So input LUT would come before your corrections, or you can put a LUT after your basic corrections, which tends to be a little bit milder because it's going to be applied after the corrections. So whichever one comes first, so if it was an input LUT, the input LUT would do its changes first, then the corrections would go on top of it. Any values that are darker on the input LUT would take hold first. Then you have what is called a look. This is basically a LUT that you would put on top of what corrections you've already made. This tends to be milder because the corrections will take priority and then the LUT is secondary. In this case, I used a base input LUT for an Alexa camera. I thought this is what looked good to start with. And then I applied another look or another LUT on top of that called SL Gold Heat, which is built into Lumetri, and applied that very lightly. So if I take this down, this is what the basic correction did with the input LUT, and this is where it took it. And then after that, I used another LUT on top of that to bring more of a gold, warm, and shadowy feel, so that everything is just nice, warm, and golden, and everything else is kind of subdued. And you can do a few different things here in the Creative tab. You can fade it, which basically essentially just lifts the blacks up into the shadow range and gives you kind of a vintage look. You can apply some sharpening here, which I probably should have done in this one, but I wanted it to feel more like a helicopter camera, so not quite as sharp, kind of blurry. And then saturation, you can up the saturation here in a lot of cases, but I tend to err on the desaturated kind of feel. I kind of like it to not be so poppy and warm, especially in this video series where it's going to be kind of more towards a horror type of genre. So that is how I color graded this shot. I'll show you how I color grade some other normal DSLR stuff in another video. I'm gonna continue this because this one's kind of going a little bit long. So hopefully this helped you create better videos and understand color grading a little bit more. I'll go into a more affordable type of color grading later and show you how you can use that. But until next time, this is Sean Michael Jordan, and I hope to see you next week.